The Doctor is back on Mini Monsters, and for good reason. You see, the sick, twisted fuck that I'm about to highlight is such a disgusting human being that I couldn't stand the idea of this story being told by the innocently angelic Amy Rose. But with the passing of acting legend Donald Sutherland, we felt it fit to cover a monster once portrayed by Sutherland himself in the movie Citizen X. And that is the monster Andrei Chikatilo. So buckle up, because this might be a long one. Andrei Chikatilo was born on the 16th of October 1936 in a village in the Ukrainian SSR. At the time of his birth, Ukraine was recovering from a severe famine caused by Joseph Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture. Chikatilo's parents were both collective farmer laborers who lived in a one-room hut. They received no wage for their work, but instead received the right to cultivate a plot of land behind the family hut. The family seldom had sufficient food. Chikatilo himself later claimed not to have eaten bread until the age of 12, adding that he and his family often had to eat grass and leaves in an effort to stave off hunger. Throughout his childhood, Chikatilo was repeatedly told by his mother Anna that prior to his birth, an older brother of his named Stefan had, at the age of 4, been kidnapped and cannibalized by starving neighbors, although it has never been established whether this incident actually occurred, or if a Stefan Chikatilo even existed. Nonetheless, Chikatilo recalled his childhood as being blighted by poverty, ridicule, hunger, and war. When the Soviet Union entered the Second World War, Chikatilo's father, Roman, was conscripted into the Red Army. He would later be taken prisoner after being wounded in combat. Between 1941 and 1944, Chikatilo witnessed some of the effects of the Nazi occupation of the Ukraine, which he described as horrors, adding his witness to bombings, fires, and shootings from which he and his mother would hide in cellars and ditches. On one occasion, Chikatilo and his mother were forced to watch their own hut burn to the ground. With his father at war, Chikatilo and his mother shared a single bed. He was a chronic bedwetter, and his mother berated and beat him for each offence. In 1943, Chikatilo's mother gave birth to a baby girl, Titania. Because Chikatilo's father had been conscripted in 1941, he could not have fathered this child. As many Ukrainian women were raped by German soldiers during the war, it was speculated Titania was conceived as a result of a rape committed by a German soldier. As Chikatilo and his mother lived in a one-room hut, this rape may have been committed in Chikatilo's presence. In September 1944, Chikatilo began his schooling. Although shy and ardently studious as a child, he was physically weak and regularly attended school in homespun clothing. His stomach was often swollen from hunger resulting from the post-war famine that plagued much of the Soviet Union. On several occasions, his hunger caused Chikatilo to faint both at home and at school, and he was consistently targeted by bullies who regularly mocked him over his physical stature and timid nature. At home, Chikatilo and his sister were constantly berated by their mother. Titania later recalled that in spite of the hardships endured by her parents, their father was a kind man, whereas their mother was harsh and unforgiving towards her children. Chikatilo developed a passion for reading and memorizing data and often studied at home, both to increase his sense of self-worth and to compensate for his myopia, which often prevented him from reading the classroom blackboard. To his teachers, Chikatilo was an excellent student upon whom they would regularly bestow praise and commendation. By his teens, Chikatilo was both a model student and an ardent communist. He was appointed editor of the school newspaper at the age of 14 and chairman of the Pupils' Communist Party Committee 2 years later. An avid reader of communist literature, he was also delegated the task of organizing street marches. Although Chikatilo claimed learning did not come easy to him due to headaches and a poor memory, he was the only student from his collective farm to complete the final year of study, graduating with excellent grades in 1954. At the onset of puberty, Chikatilo discovered that he had chronic impotence, worsening his social awkwardness and self-hatred. He was shy in the company of women. His first crush at the age of 17 had been a girl by the name of Lilia Barasheva, with whom he had become acquainted through the school newspaper. Yet he was chronically nervous in her company and never asked her for a date. The same year, Chikatilo jumped upon an 11-year-old friend of his younger sister and wrestled her to the ground, ejaculating as the girl struggled in his grasp. Following his graduation, Chikatilo applied for a scholarship at Moscow State University. Although he passed the entrance examination with good to excellent scores, his grades were not deemed good enough for acceptance. Chikatilo speculated his scholarship application was rejected due to his father's tainted war record. His father had been branded a traitor for being taken prisoner in 1943. But the truth was that other students had performed better in a highly competitive exam. He did not attempt to enroll at another university. Instead, he traveled to the city of Kursk, where he worked as a laborer for 3 months before in 1955 enrolling in a vocational school with the aim of becoming a communications technician. The same year, Chikatilo formed his first serious relationship with a local girl 2 years his junior. On 3 occasions, the couple attempted intercourse, but on each occasion he was unable to sustain an erection. After 18 months, she broke off the relationship. Fucking hell, she's more patient than I am. Upon the completion of his 2-year vocational training, Chikatilo relocated to the Ural city of Nizhny Tagil, that's definitely wrong, to work upon a long-term construction project. While living in this place, he also undertook correspondence courses in engineering with the Moscow Electrotechnical Institution of Communication. He worked in the Urals for 2 years until he was drafted into the Soviet Army in 1957. Chikatilo performed his compulsory military service between 1957 and 1960, assigned first to serve with border guards in Central Asia, then to a KGB communications unit in East Berlin. Here his work record was unblemished, and he joined the Communist Party shortly before his military service ended in 1960. Upon completing his service, Chikatilo returned to his native village to live with his parents, briefly working alongside them on the collective farm. He soon became acquainted with a young divorcee. Their 3-month relationship ended after several unsuccessful attempts at intercourse, after which the woman innocently asked her friend for advice as to how Chikatilo might overcome his inability to maintain an erection. As a result, most of his peers discovered his impotence. In a 1993 interview regarding this incident, Chikatilo stated, "Girls were going behind my back whispering that I was impotent. I was so ashamed. I tried to hang myself. My mother and some young neighbors pulled me out of the noose. Well, I thought no one would want such a shamed man, so I had to run away from there, away from my homeland." After several months, Chikatilo found a job as a communications engineer in a town located north of Rostov-on-Don. He relocated to the Russian SFSR in 1961, renting a small apartment close to his workplace. The same year, his younger sister Tatiana, finishing her schooling, and moved into his apartment. His parents would relocate to Rostov region shortly thereafter. Tatiana lived with her brother for 6 months before marrying a local youth and moving into her in-laws' home. She noted nothing untoward with regard to her brother's lifestyle beyond his chronic shyness around women, and resolved to help her brother find a wife and start a family. In 1963, Chikatilo married a woman named Feodosia Yudnacheva, to whom he had been introduced by his younger sister. According to Chikatilo, although he was attracted to Feodosia, his marriage was effectively an arranged one, which occurred barely 2 weeks after he had met, and in which the decisive roles were played by his sister and her husband. Chikatilo later claimed that his marital sex life was minimal, and that after his wife understood he was unable to maintain an erection, they agreed she would conceive by him ejaculating externally and pushing his semen inside her vagina with his fingers. In 1965, Feodosia gave birth to a daughter, Lyudmila. 4 years later, in 1969, a son named Yuri was born. Chikatilo chose to enroll as a correspondence student to Rostov University in 1964. Studying Russian literature and philology, he obtained his degree in these subjects in 1970. Shortly after obtaining his degree, he obtained a job managing regional sports activities. Chikatilo remained in this position for 1 year before beginning his career as a teacher of Russian language and literature at vocational school number 32 in Novoshakhtinsk. Chikatilo was largely ineffective as a teacher. Although knowledgeable in the subjects he taught, he was seldom able to maintain discipline in his classes and was regularly subjected to mockery by students who, he claimed, took advantage of his modest nature. One of Chikatilo's duties at the school was ensuring the students who boarded at the school were present in their dormitories in the evenings. On several occasions, he is known to have entered the girls' dormitory in the hope of seeing them undressed. On other occasions, he discovered adolescent pupils who boarded at the school engaged in sex. He later stated the sight of adolescents engaged in intercourse disturbed him, as he was confronted by the sight of children doing what I hadn't done even when I was 30 years old. In May 1973, Chikatilo committed his first known sexual assault upon one of his pupils. In this incident, he swam towards a 15-year-old girl and groped her breast and genitals, ejaculating as the girl struggled against his grasp. Months later, Chikatilo sexually assaulted and beat another teenage girl whom he had locked in his classroom. He was not disciplined for either of these incidents, nor for the occasion in which fellow teachers observed Chikatilo fondling himself in the presence of his students. In response to the increasing numbers of complaints lodged against him by pupils, the director of the school summoned Chikatilo to a formal meeting and informed him he should either resign voluntarily or be fired. Chikatilo left his employment discreetly and found a job in the same town in January 1974. He lost this job as a result of staff cutbacks in September 1978 before finding another teaching position in Technical School number 33 in Shekty, a coal mining town 47 miles north of Rostov. By Chikatilo's own admission, by the mid-1970s, his desire to view naked children drove him to loiter around public toilets where he frequently spied on young girls. He also purchased chewing gum, which he gave to female children he encountered in efforts to initiate contact and gain their trust. Chikatilo is known to have sexually assaulted at least 3 girls whom he encountered via this method. Chikatilo's career as a teacher ended in March 1981 following several complaints of child molestation against pupils of both sexes. The same month, he began a job as a supply clerk for a factory based in Rostov which produced construction materials. This job required Chikatilo to travel extensively across much of the Soviet Union, either to physically purchase the raw materials required to fulfill production quotas or to negotiate supply contracts. In September 1978, Chikatilo moved to Shekt, where he committed his first documented murder. On the evening of the 22nd of December, he lured a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakatonova to an old, dilapidated hut, which he had secretly purchased that year. He attempted to rape her but failed to achieve an erection. When the girl struggled, he choked her and stabbed her 3 times in the abdomen, ejaculating while stabbing the girl. In an interview after his 1990 arrest, Chikatilo later recalled that immediately after he stabbed the girl had said something very hoarsely, whereupon he strangled her into unconsciousness before throwing her body into the nearby river. Her body was found beneath a nearby bridge 2 days later. Numerous pieces of evidence linked Chikatilo to the girl's murder. Spots of blood had been found in the snow close to the fence facing the house Chikatilo had purchased. Neighbours had noted that Chikatilo had been present in the house on the evening of the 22nd of December. The girl's school backpack had been found upon the opposite bank of the river at the end of the street, indicating the girl had been thrown into the river at this location. And a witness had given police a detailed description of a man closely resembling Chikatilo, whom she had seen talking with the girl at the bus stop where the girl had last been seen alive. Despite these facts, a 25-year-old labourer named Alexander Krakochenko, who had previously served a prison sentence for rape and murder of a teenage girl, was arrested for the crime. A search of his home revealed spots of blood on his wife's jumper. The blood type was determined to match the girl's and his wife's. How the fuck they managed that? He had a very strong alibi for the afternoon on the 22nd of December 1978. He had been at home with his wife and a friend of hers the entire afternoon, and neighbours of the couple were able to verify this. Nonetheless, the police, having threatened his wife with being an accomplice to murder and her friend to perjury, obtained a new statement in which the women claimed that he had not returned home until late in the evening on the day of the murder. Confronted with these altered testimonies, he was forced to confess to the killing. He was tried for the murder in 1979. At this trial, he retracted his confession and maintained his innocence, stating his confession had been obtained under extreme duress. Despite his retraction, he was convicted of the murder and sentenced to death. This sentence was commuted to 15 years imprisonment, the maximum possible length of imprisonment at the time, by the Supreme Court in December 1980. Under pressure from the victim's relatives, he was retired, erroneously convicted, and eventually executed by firing squad for her murder in July 1983. Following Yelana's murder, Chikatilo was able to achieve sexual arousal and orgasm only through stabbing and slashing women and children to death, and he later claimed that the urge to relive the experience had overwhelmed him. Nonetheless, Chikatilo did stress that initially he had struggled to resist these urges, often cutting short business trips to return home rather than face the temptation to search for a victim. On the 3rd of September 1981, Chikatilo encountered a 17-year-old boarding school student, Larissa Tachenko, standing at a bus stop as he exited a public library in Rostov city centre. According to his subsequent confession, Chikatilo lured Larissa to a forest near the Don River with the pretext of drinking vodka and relaxing. When they reached the secluded area, he threw the girl to the ground before tearing off her clothes and attempting intercourse. As Larissa remonstrated against his actions, when Chikatilo failed to achieve an erection, he forced mud inside her mouth to stifle her screams before battering and strangling her to death. As he had no knife, Chikatilo mutilated the body with his teeth and a 6-foot-long stick. He also tore one nipple from the girl's body with his teeth before loosely covering her body with leaves, branches, and torn pages of newspaper. Larissa's body was found the following day. 9 months after the murder of Larissa, on the 12th of June 1982, Chikatilo traveled by bus to the Bagayevsky district of Rostov to purchase vegetables. Having to change bus at the village of Donskoy, he decided to continue his journey on foot. Walking away from the bus station, he encountered a 13-year-old girl, Lyubov Buryuk, who was walking home from a shopping trip. The two walked together for approximately a quarter of a mile until their path was shielded from view of potential witnesses by bushes, whereupon Chikatilo pounced on the girl, dragging her into a nearby undergrowth. He tore off her clothes and killed her by stabbing and slashing her to death as he imitated performing intercourse. When her body was found on the 27th of June, the medical examiner discovered evidence of 22 knife wounds inflicted to the head, neck, chest, and pelvic region. Further wounds found in the skull suggested the killer had attacked her from behind with the handle and blade of his knife. In addition, several striations were discovered upon her eye socket. Following the girl's murder, Chikatilo no longer attempted to resist his homicidal urges. Between July and September 1982, he killed a further 5 victims between the ages of 9 and 18. He established a pattern of approaching children, runaway and young vagrants at buses or railway stations, inciting them to repeat to a nearby forest or other secluded areas and killing them, usually by stabbing, slashing or eviscerating the victim with a knife. Although some victims, in addition to receiving a multitude of knife wounds, were also strangled or battered to death. Many of the victims' bodies bore evidence of mutilation to the eye socket. Pathologists concluded these injuries had been caused by a knife, leading investigators to the conclusion the killer had gouged out the eyes of his victims. Chikatilo's adult female victims were often prostitutes or homeless women whom he would lure to secluded areas with promises of alcohol or money. He would typically attempt intercourse with these victims, but he would usually be unable to achieve or maintain an erection. This would send him into a murderous fury, particularly if the woman mocked his impotence. He would achieve orgasm only when he stabbed and slashed the victim to death. Chikatilo's child and adolescent victims were of both sexes. He would lure these victims to secluded areas using a variety of ruses, usually formed in the initial conversations with the victim, such as promising them assistance or company or offering to show them a shortcut, a chance to view rare stamps, films or coins, or with an offer of food or candy. He would usually overpower these victims once they were alone, often tying their hands behind their backs with a length of rope before stuffing mud or foam into their victim's mouth to silence their screams, and then proceed to kill them. After the killing, Chikatilo would make rudimentary, although seldom serious, efforts to conceal the body before leaving the crime scene. On the 11th of December 1982, Chikatilo encountered a 10-year-old girl named Olga Stolmaknak riding a bus to her parents' home in Novoshatinsk. Still can't say that properly. And persuaded the child to leave the bus with him. He was last seen by a fellow passenger, who reported that a middle-aged man had led the girl away firmly by the hand. Chikatilo lured the girl to a cornfield on the outskirts of the city, stabbed her in excess of 50 times around the head and body, ripped open her chest, and excised her lower bowels and uterus. By January 1983, 4 victims thus far killed had been tentatively linked to the same killer. A Moscow police team headed by Major Mikhail Festov was sent to Rostov to direct the investigation, which gradually became known among investigators as Operation Forest Path. Fedosov established a team of 10 investigators based in Rostov, charged with solving all 4 cases. In March, Fedosov assigned a newly appointed forensic analyst, Viktor Burakov, to head the investigation. The following month, Stolmakhanak's body was found. Burakov was summoned to the crime scene, where he examined the numerous knife wounds and eviscerations conducted upon the child and the striations on her eye socket. Burakov later stated that he had noted the striations upon the girl's eye socket. Any doubts about the presence of a serial killer evaporated. Chikatilo did not kill again until June 1983, when he murdered a 15-year-old Armenian girl named Laura Saritskian. Her body was found close to an unmarked railway platform near Shikht. By September, he had killed a further 5 victims. The accumulation of bodies found and the similarities between the pattern of wounds inflicted on the victims forced the Soviet authorities to acknowledge that a serial killer was on the loose. On the 6th of September 1983, the public prosecutor of the Soviet Union formally linked 6 of the murders thus far attributed to the same killer. Due to the sheer savagery of the murders and the precision of the eviscerations upon the victims' bodies, police theorized that the killings had been conducted by either a group harvesting organs to sell for transplant, or the work of a satanic cult, or a mentally ill individual. Much of the police effort concentrated upon the theory that the killer must be mentally ill, homosexual, or a paedophile, and that the alibis of all individuals who had either spent time in a psychiatric ward or had been convicted of homosexuality or paedophilia were checked and logged in a card filing system. Registered sex offenders were also investigated, and if their alibi was corroborated, eliminated from the inquiry. Beginning in September 1983, several young men confessed to the murders, although these individuals were often intellectually disabled youths who admitted to the crimes only under prolonged and often brutal interrogation. 3 known homosexuals and a convicted sex offender committed suicide as a result of the investigators' heavy-handed tactics. As a result of the investigation, more than 1,000 unrelated crimes, including 95 murders, 140 aggravated assaults, and 245 rapes, were solved. However, as police obtained confessions from suspects, bodies continued to be discovered, proving that the suspects who had confessed could not be the killer they were seeking. On the 30th of October 1983, the eviscerated body of a 19-year-old prostitute, Vera Shevkin, was found in Shikht. Shevkin had been killed on the 27th of October. Although the mutilations inflicted upon her body were otherwise characteristic of those found upon other victims linked to the unknown murder, the victim's eyes had not been enucleated or otherwise wounded. 2 months later, on the 27th of December, a 14-year-old Gukova schoolboy, Sergei Markov, was lured off a train and murdered at a rural station. Markov was emasculated and suffered over 70 knife wounds to his neck and upper torso before being eviscerated. In January and February 1984, Chikatilo killed 2 women in Rostov's Park of Aviators. On the 24th of March, he lured a 10-year-old boy, Dmitry Pashtiknov, away from a stamp kiosk in his hometown. While walking with the boy, Chikatilo was seen by several witnesses who were able to give investigators a detailed description of the killer. When the boy's body was found 3 days later, police also found a footprint by the killer and both semen and saliva samples on the victim's clothing. On the 25th of May, Chikatilo killed a young woman named Tatiana Petrosina and a 10-year-old daughter, Svetlana, in a wooded area outside of Shikht. Tatiana had known Chikatilo for several years prior to her murder. By the end of July, he had killed 3 additional young women between the ages of 19 and 21 and a 13-year-old boy. In the summer of 1984, Chikatilo was fired from his work as a supply clerk for the theft of 2 rolls of aluminum. The accusation had been filed against him the previous February, and he had been asked to resign quietly but had refused to do so as he denied the charges. Chikatilo found another job as a supply clerk in Rostov on the 1st of August. On the 2nd of August, Chikatilo killed a 16-year-old girl, Natalia Goloskoskaya, in the Park of Aviators. On the 7th of August, he lured a 17-year-old girl, Ludmila Alexeyeva, to the banks of the Don River on the pretense of showing her a shortcut to a bus terminal. The girl suffered 39 slash wounds to her body before Chikatilo mutilated and disemboweled her, intentionally inflicting wounds he knew would not be immediately fatal. Her body was found the following morning, her excised upper lip inside her mouth. Hours after her murder, Chikatilo flew to the Uzbek capital of Tashkent on a business trip to purchase electrical switches. By the time he returned to Rostov on the 15th of August, he had killed an unidentified young woman and a 10-year-old girl, Akamaral Sidelyeva. Within 2 weeks, the nude body of an 11-year-old boy named Alexander Chepel was discovered on the banks of the Don River, strangled and castrated, with his eyes gouged out, just yards from where Alexeyeva's body had earlier been found. And on the 6th of September, Chikatilo killed a young librarian, 24-year-old Irina Luchinskaya, in the Park of Aviators. On the 13th of September 1984, Chikatilo was observed by 2 undercover detectives attempting to talk to a young woman at a Rostov bus station. The detectives followed him as he wandered through the city, trying to approach women and committing acts of flirtation in public places. Upon Chikatilo's arrival at the city's central market, he was arrested and held. A search of his belongings revealed a knife with a 20cm or 7.9-inch blade, several lengths of rope, and a jar of Vaseline. He was also discovered to be under investigation for minor theft at one of his former employers, which gave the investigators the legal right to hold him for a prolonged period of time. Chikatilo's dubious background was uncovered, and his physical description matched the description of the man seen walking alongside Dmitry prior to the boy's murder. A sample of Chikatilo's blood was taken, the results of which revealed his blood group to be type A, whereas semen samples found upon a total of 6 victims murdered by the unknown killer throughout the spring of summer 1984 had been classified by medical examiners to be Class AB. Chikatilo's name was added to the card index file used by investigators. However, the results of the blood type analysis largely discounted him of being the unknown killer. Chikatilo was found guilty of theft and of property from his previous employer. His membership of the Communist Party was revoked and he was sentenced to 1 year in prison. He was released from custody on the 12th of December 1984 after serving 3 months. On the 8th of October 1984, the head of the Russian Public Prosecutor's Office formally linked 23 of Chikatilo's murder into one case and dropped all charges against the mentally disabled youths who had previously confessed to the murders. Upon his release from prison in December 1984, Chikatilo found new work within the supply department of a locomotive factory in his old town and kept a low profile. He did not kill again until August 1st, 1985, when on a business trip to Moscow he encountered an 18-year-old woman named Natalia Poklistova standing on a railway platform near Domodova Airport. Natalia was lured off a train into a thicket of woods close to the village of Vosterkovo, where she was bound, stabbed 38 times in her neck and chest, then strangled to death. Based upon the hypothesis that the killer had traveled from the Rostov Oblast to Moscow via air, investigators checked all air flight records of passengers who had commuted between Moscow and the Rostov region between late July and early August. On this occasion, however, Chikatilo had traveled to Moscow by train, and accordingly no documentation existed for investigators to research. 4 weeks later, on the 27th of August, Chikatilo killed another young woman, Irina Golieva, in Shikti. As had been the case with the others, the wounds inflicted upon the victim linked her murder to the hunt for the serial killer. In November 1985, a special procurator, Isaiah Kostoyev, was appointed to supervise the investigation, which had at this stage expanded to include 15 procurators and 29 detectives assigned to work exclusively upon the manhunt. The known murders linked to the manhunt was carefully re-investigated. The police began another round of questioning of known sex offenders and homosexuals. The following month, the militia resumed the patrolling of railway stations around Rostov, and plainclothes female officers were ordered to loiter around bus and train stations. After a request of Bukharov, police also took the step of consulting a psychiatrist, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, the first such consultation in a serial killer investigation in the Soviet Union. All crime scene and medical examiner reports were made available to Bukhanovsky upon the understanding he would produce a psychological profile of the unknown murderer for investigators. Bukhanovsky's 65-page psychological profile described the killer as a reclusive man aged between 45 and 50 years old who had endured a painful and isolated childhood, and who was incapable of flirting or courtship with women. This individual would be well educated, likely to be married and have fathered children, but also a sadist who suffered from impotence and could achieve sexual arousal and release only by seeing his victims suffer. The murderers themselves were an analogue of the sexual intercourse this individual was incapable of performing, and his knife became a substitute for a penis which failed to function normally. Because many of the killings had occurred on weekdays near mass transport hubs and across the entire Rostov Oblast, Bukhanovsky also argued that the killer's work required him to travel regularly, and based upon the actual days of the week when the killings had occurred, the killer was most likely tied to a production schedule. Chikatilo followed the investigation carefully, reading newspaper reports about the manhunt for the killer, which had begun to appear in the press, and keeping his homicidal urges under control. For almost a year following the August 1985 murder of Golieva, no further victims were found in either the Rostov or Moscow Oblasts, whose bodies bore the signature mutilations of the unknown murderer. Investigators did tentatively link the murder of a 33-year-old woman named Lyubov Golokova, found stabbed to death in Rostov on the 23rd of July 1986, to the investigation, although this was solely upon the basis that the killer's semen type matched that of the killer they were seeking, that the victim had been stripped naked prior to her murder, and that she had been stabbed in excess of 20 times. The victim had not been dismembered or otherwise mutilated, nor had she been seen near mass transportation. Because of these discrepancies, many investigators expressed serious doubts as to whether this murder had been committed by the killer they were seeking. On the 18th of August 1986, a victim was found buried in a depression of earth in the grounds of a collective farm in the city of Bataishsk. The wounds inflicted on this victim bore the trademark mutilations of victims linked to the manhunt killed between 1982 and 1985. The victim was an 18-year-old court secretary named Irina Pokorolova. Her body had been slit open from the neck to the genitalia, with one breast removed and her eyes cut out. As the murderer had made serious efforts to bury the body, some investigators theorized that this explained the sudden dearth in number of victims found. As the victims killed in the Rostov Oblast in 1985 and 1986 had died in the months of July and August, by the autumn of 1986, some investigators gave credence to the possibility that the perpetrator had relocated to another part of the Soviet Union and was returning to the Rostov Oblast only in the summer. The Rostov police compiled bulletins to be sent to all forces throughout the Soviet Union, describing the pattern of wounds their unknown killer inflicted upon his victims and requesting feedback from any police force who had discovered murder victims with wounds matching these upon the victims found in the Rostov Oblast. The response was negative. In 1987, Chikatilo killed 3 times. On each occasion, the murder took place while he was on a business trip far away from the Rostov Oblast, and none of these murders were linked to the manhunt in Rostov. Chikatilo's first murder in 1987 was committed on the 16th of May when he encountered a 12-year-old boy, Oleg Makarenkov, at a train station in the Urals town of Revda. Makarenkov was lured from the station with the promise of sharing a meal with Chikatilo at his dacha. He was murdered in woodland close to the station, although his body would remain undiscovered until 1991. In July, he killed a 12-year-old boy, Ivan Bilovsky, in the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia, and on the 15th of September, he killed a 16-year-old vocational school student, Yuri Tereshchuk, in the woodland on the outskirts of Leningrad. In 1988, Chikatilo killed 3 times, murdering an unidentified woman in Kherson-Sulin in April and 2 boys in May and July. His first murder victim was lured off a train at Kherson-Sulin before Chikatilo bound her hands behind her back and stuffed her mouth with dirt before severing her nose from her face and inflicting numerous knife wounds to her neck. Chikatilo then bludgeoned her to death with a slab of concrete. Her body was found on the 6th of April. Investigators noted that the knife wounds inflicted upon this victim were similar to those inflicted on the victims linked to the manhunt and killed between 1982 and 1985. But as the woman had been killed with a slab of concrete, had not been disemboweled, and her murderer had not wounded her eyes or genitals, investigators were unsure whether to link this murder to the investigation. In May, Chikatilo killed a 9-year-old boy named Alexei Voronko in the Ukrainian city of Ilovaisk. The boy's, I'm sorry for all the pronunciations in this episode. The boy's wounds left no doubt the killer had struck again, and the murder was linked to the manhunt. On the 14th of July, Chikatilo killed a 15-year-old Yevgeny Muratov at Dolanskov station before Shikti. Muratova's murder was also linked to the investigation, although his body was not found until April 1989. Although his remains were largely skeletal, the autopsy revealed he had been emasculated and had suffered at least 30 knife wounds. Chikatilo did not kill again until the 28th of February 1989 when he killed a 16-year-old girl, Tatiana Rosova, in his daughter's vacant apartment. He dismembered her body and hid the remains in a nearby sewer. As the victim had been dismembered, police did not link her murder to the investigation. Between May and August, Chikatilo killed a further 4 victims, 3 of whom were killed in Rostov and Shikti, although only 2 of these victims were linked to the manhunt. With the resurfacing of victims definitively linked to the manhunt and the fact that the majority of the victims' bodies had been discovered close to the railway stations, investigators assigned numerous plainclothes officers to discreetly film and photograph passengers on trains throughout the Rostov Oblast. Several trains were also fitted with hidden cameras with the intention of filming and photographing a victim in the company of his or her murderer. On the 14th of January 1990, Chikatilo encountered an 11-year-old Andrei Krakochenko standing outside a Shikti theatre. Andrei was lured from the theatre on the pretext of being shown imported Western films Chikatilo claimed to have had at his residence. His extensively stabbed emasculated body was found in a secluded section of woodland the following month. 7 weeks after his murder, on the 7th of March, Chikatilo lured a 10-year-old boy Yaroslav Makarov from a Rostov train station to Rostov's botanical gardens. His eviscerated body was found the following day. On the 11th of March, the leaders of the investigation, headed by Fedosov, held a meeting to discuss progress made in the manhunt. Fedosov was under intense pressure from the public, the press, and the Soviet Ministry of Interior to solve the case. Both he and Viktor Burakov had devoted extensive time and effort over the previous 7 years in their efforts to apprehend the perpetrator. The intensity of the manhunt in the years up to 1984 had receded to a degree between 1985 and 1987, when Chikatilo had committed only 3 murders investigators had conclusively linked to the killer, all killed by 1986. However, by March 1990, a further 6 victims had been linked to the killer. In addition, following the introduction of greater media freedom as a result of Glasnost, the Soviets' news media was much less repressed than it had been in the earlier years of the manhunt, and accordingly devoted extensive publicity to the case. Fedosov had also noted laxity in some areas of the investigation and warned that people would be fired if the killer was not caught soon. Chikatilo had killed 3 further victims in August 1990. On 4th of April, he lured a 31-year-old woman off a train and killed her in a woodland near the station. Her body was not found until the 24th of August. On the 28th of July, he lured a 13-year-old boy away from a Rostov railway station and killed him in the botanical gardens. And on the 14th of August, he killed an 11-year-old boy in the reeds near a beach. The discovery of more victims sparked a massive police operation. Because several victims' bodies had been discovered at railway stations on one rail route through the Rostov Oblast, Burakov suggested a plan to saturate all larger stations in the region with an obvious uniformed police presence, which the killer could not fail to notice. The intention was to discourage the killer from attempting to strike at any of these locations, and have undercover agents patrol smaller and less busy stations where the murderer's activities would be more likely to be noticed. The plan was approved, and both the uniformed and undercover officers were instructed to question any adult man in the company of a young woman or child and note his name and passport number. Police deployed 360 men at all the stations in the Rostov Oblast, but only undercover officers were posted at the 3 smallest stations on the route through the oblast where the killer had struck most frequently. In an effort to force the killer to strike at one of these 3 stations, the operation was implemented on the 27th of October 1990 in full effect. On the 30th of October, police found the body of a 16-year-old boy near the Donleskov's station. The wounds upon Gurmov's body immediately linked his murder to the manhunt. The youth had been strangled, stabbed 27 times, and castrated, with the tip of his tongue severed and his left eye stabbed. The boy had been killed on the 17th of October, 10 days before the start of the initiative. The same day the body was found, Chikatilo lured another 16-year-old boy off a train at the Kirpichnya station and killed him at a nearby forest. The body, bearing 40 separate knife wounds, was found on the 3rd of November. On November 6th, 1990, Chikatilo killed and mutilated a 22-year-old woman, Svetlana Korostik, in woodlands near a station. Returning to the railway platform, he was noticed by an undercover officer named Igor Rybakov, who observed Chikatilo approach a well and wash his hands and face. When he approached the station, the officer also noticed that Chikatilo's coat had grass and soil stains on the elbows. Chikatilo also had a small red smear on his cheek and what appeared to be a severe wound on one of his fingers. To the officer, he looked suspicious. The only reason people entered the woodland near that station at the time of year was to gather wild mushrooms, the popular pastime in Russia. But Chikatilo was not dressed like a typical forest scavenger. He was wearing more formal attire. Moreover, he had a nylon sports bag which was unsuitable for carrying mushrooms. The officer stopped Chikatilo and checked his papers, but had no formal reason to arrest him. When the officer returned to his office, he filed a routine report containing the name of the person he had stopped at the station and a possible blood smear observed upon his cheek. On the 13th of November, when the body was found, she was the 38th victim linked to the manhunt. Police summoned the officer in charge of surveillance of that station and examined the report of all men stopped and questioned in the previous week. Not only was Chikatilo's name among these reports, but it was familiar to several officers involved in the case because he had been questioned in 1984 and had been placed upon the 1987 suspect list compiled and distributed throughout the Soviet Union. After checking with Chikatilo's present and previous employers, investigators were able to place him in various towns and cities at times when several victims linked to the investigations had been murdered. Questioning the former colleagues of Chikatilo's teaching days revealed that he had been forced to resign from 2 teaching positions due to repeated complaints of lewd behavior and sexual assault made by his pupils. Police placed Chikatilo under surveillance on the 14th of November. In several instances, particularly on trains or buses, he was observed approaching lone young women or children and engaging them in conversation. If the woman or child broke off the conversation, Chikatilo would wait a few minutes and then seek another conversation partner. On the 20th of November, after 6 days of surveillance, Chikatilo left his house with a large jar, which he had filled with beer at a small kiosk in the local park. He then made his way around the town, attempting to make contact with children he met on his way. Upon exiting a cafe, Chikatilo was arrested by 4 plainclothes police officers. He offered no resistance as he was handcuffed and placed inside an unmarked police car. Upon his arrest, Chikatilo gave a statement claiming that the police were mistaken and complained that he had also been arrested in 1984 for the same series of murders. A strip search of the suspect revealed a further piece of evidence. One of Chikatilo's fingers had a deep flesh wound he had self-treated with iodine. Medical examiners concluded the wound was from a human bite. Chikatilo's penultimate victim, Viktor Tishenko, was a physically strong youth. At the crime scene, the police had found numerous signs of a ferocious physical struggle between the victim and his murderer. Although a finger bone was later found to be broken and his nail had been bitten off, Chikatilo had never sought medical treatment for his injury. A search of Chikatilo's belongings revealed he was in possession of a folding knife and 2 lengths of rope. A sample of his blood was taken and he was placed in a cell inside the KGB headquarters in Rostov with a police informer, who was instructed to engage Chikatilo in conversation and elicit any information he could from him. The next day, on the 21st of November, formal questioning of Chikatilo began. The interrogation was performed by Andrei Romanovich. The strategy chosen by police to elicit a confession was to lead Chikatilo to believe that he was a very sick individual in need of medical help. The intention was to give Chikatilo hope that if he confessed, he would not be prosecuted by reason of insanity. Police knew their case against Chikatilo was largely circumstantial, and under Soviet law, they had 10 days in which they could legally hold a suspect before either charging or releasing him. On the 21st of November, the result of Chikatilo's blood test again revealed the blood type to be type A and not type AB. Due to the amount of physical and circumstantial evidence investigators had thus far compiled, which indicated Chikatilo was indeed the murderer they had been pursuing, plus the fact that investigators had deduced the blood type of the murderer they had pursued using semen samples obtained from the clothing and bodies of 14 of the victims as opposed to the actual blood samples, investigators obtained a sample of Chikatilo's semen to test his blood type, the results of which confirmed Chikatilo's semen was type AB, whereas the blood and saliva were type A. Throughout the questioning, Chikatilo repeatedly denied that he had committed the murders, although he did confess to molesting several of his pupils during his career as a teacher. He also produced several written essays for Kostoyev, which, although evasive regarding the actual murders, did reveal psychological symptoms consistent with those predicted by Dr. Bukhanovsky in the 1985 profile he had written for the investigators. The interrogation tactics used by Kostoyev may have also caused Chikatilo to become defensive. The informer sharing a KGB cell with the suspect reported to police that Chikatilo had informed him that Kostoyev had repeatedly asked him direct questions regarding mutilations inflicted upon the victims. On the 29th of November, at the request of Burakov and Fedosov, Dr. Bukhanovsky was invited to assist in the questioning of the suspect. Bukhanovsky read extracts from his 65-page psychological profile to Chikatilo. Within 2 hours, Chikatilo burst into tears and confessed to Bukhanovsky that he was indeed guilty of the crimes for which he had been arrested. After conversing into the evening, Bukhanovsky reported to Burakov and Fedosov that Chikatilo was ready to confess. Armed with the handwritten notes Bukhanovsky had prepared, Kostoyev prepared a formal accusation of murder dated 29th of November, the eve of the expiration of the 10-day time period during which Chikatilo would legally be held before being charged. The following morning, Kostoyev resumed the interrogation. According to the official protocol, Chikatilo confessed to 36 of the 38 murders police had linked to him. Although he denied 2 additional murders committed in 1986, the police had initially believed he had committed. One of these victims was Lyubov Golovaka, found stabbed to death on the 23rd of July 1986, and whom many investigators had serious doubts about linking to the manhunt. The second was Irina Pogoroilova, found murdered in Balatish on the 18th of August 1986, and whose mutilations closely matched those inflicted upon other victims linked to the manhunt. Chikatilo gave a full detailed description of each murder on the list of charges, all of which were consistent with known facts regarding each killing. When prompted, he would draw a rough sketch of various crime scenes, indicating the position of victims' bodies and various landmarks in the vicinity of the crime scene. Additional details provided further proof of his guilt. One victim on the list of charges was a 19-year-old student named Anna Lemasheva, whom Chikatilo had killed on the 19th of July 1984. Chikatilo recalled that he had fought to overpower her. She had stated that a man named Bars would retaliate for his attacking her. Lemasheva's fiancé had the nickname Bars tattooed on his hand. In describing his victims, Chikatilo falsely referred to them as the class elements, whom he would lure to secluded areas before killing. In many instances, particularly, though not exclusively with his male victims, Chikatilo stated he would bind the victims' hands behind their backs with a length of rope before he would proceed to kill them. He would typically inflict a multitude of knife wounds upon the victim, initially inflicting shallow knife wounds to the chest area, before inflicting deeper stab and slash wounds, usually 30 to 50 in total, before proceeding to eviscerate the victim as he writhed atop his or her body until he achieved orgasm. Chikatilo had, he stated, become adept at avoiding the spurts of blood from his victim's body as he inflicted the knife wounds and eviscerations upon them, and would regularly sit or squat beside the victims until their hearts had stopped beating, adding that the victim's cries, the blood, the agony gave him relaxation and a certain pleasure. When questioned as to why most of his later victims' eyes had been stabbed or slashed, but not enucleated as his earlier victims' eyes had been, Chikatilo stated that he had initially believed in an old Russian superstition that the image of a murderer was left imprinted upon the eyes of the victim. However, he stated in later years he had become convinced this was simply an old wives' tale, and he had ceased to gouge out the eyes of his victims. Chikatilo also informed Kostoyev he had often tasted the blood of his victims, to which he stated he felt chills and shook all over. He also confessed to tearing at victims' genitals, lips, victims, and tongues with his teeth. In several instances, Chikatilo would cut or bite off the tongue of his victims as he performed his eviscerations. Then, either at or shortly after the point of death, would run around the body as he held the tongue aloft in one hand. Although he had also admitted that he had chewed upon the excised uterus of his female victims and the testicles of male victims, he stated he later discarded these body parts. Nonetheless, Chikatilo did confess to have swallowed the nipples and tongue of some of his victims. On the 30th of November, Chikatilo was formally charged with each of the 36 murders he had confessed to, all of which had been committed between June 1982 and November 1990. Over the following days, Chikatilo confessed to a further 20 killings which had not been connected to the case, either because the murders had been committed outside the Rostov Oblast, because the bodies had not been found, or in the case of Yelena, because an innocent man had been convicted and executed for the murder. As had been the case with the victims compiled upon the initial list of charges, Chikatilo was able to provide details of these additional killings only the perpetrator could have known. One of these additional victims, 14-year-old Lyubov Voloboyeva, had lived in southwestern Serbia and had been killed in a sorghum field near Krasnodar Airport on the 25th of July 1982. Chikatilo recalled that he had killed her in a millet field and that he had approached the girl as she sat in the waiting rooms of the airport. Yulaboyeva, Chikatilo stated, had informed him she lived in a Serbian city and was awaiting a connecting flight at the airport to visit relatives. On December 1990, Chikatilo led the police to the body of Alexei Kobotov, a boy he had confessed to killing in August 1989 and to whom he had buried on the outskirts of the Shikdi cemetery, proving unequivocally that he was the killer. He later led investigators to the bodies of two other victims he had confessed to killing. 3 of the 56 victims Chikatilo confessed to killing could not be found or identified, but he was charged with killing 53 women and children between 1978 and 1990. He was held in the same cell in Rostov where he had been detained on the 20th of November to await trial. On the 20th of August 1991, after police had completed their interrogation, including reenactments of all the murders at each crime scene, Chikatilo was transferred to the Serbsky Institute in Moscow to undergo 60 days of psychiatric evaluation to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Chikatilo was analysed by a senior psychiatrist who noted that Chikatilo had various psychological problems which he attributed to prenatal brain damage. Examining Chikatilo's history, it was observed a steady but gradual descent into perversion which had been compounded by biological and environmental factors, which his increasingly extreme acts of homicidal violence ultimately committed to relieve internal tension. It was concluded on the 18th of October that although he suffered from borderline personality disorder with sadistic features, he was fit to stand trial. In December 1991, details of Chikatilo's arrest and a brief summary of his crimes were released to the newly privatized Russian media by police. Chikatilo was brought to trial in Rostov on the 14th of April 1992, charged with 53 counts of murder in addition to 5 charges of sexual assault against minors committed when he had been a teacher. He was tried in the courtroom number 5 of the Rostov Principal Court before Judge Leonid Akubhanov. Chikatilo's trial was the first major media event of post-Soviet Russia. Shortly after his psychiatric evaluation at the Serbsky Institute, investigators had conducted a press conference in which a full list of Chikatilo's crimes was released to the press alongside a 1984 identikit of the individual charged, but not the full name or a photograph of the accused. The media first saw Chikatilo on the first day of his trial as he entered an iron cage specifically constructed in the corner of the courtroom to protect him from attack by the enraged and hysterical relatives of his victims. In the opening weeks of the trial, the Russian press regularly published exaggerating and often sensationalistic headlines about the murders, referring to Chikatilo being a cannibal or a maniac, and to his physical resemblance, a shaven-skulled demonic individual. The first 2 days of the trial were devoted to Akobhavanov reading a long list of indictments against Chikatilo. Each murder was discussed individually, and on several occasions relatives present in the courtroom broke down in tears or fainted when details of their relatives' murders were revealed. After reading the indictment, it was announced to journalists present in the courtroom his intention to conduct an open trial, stating, "Let this trial at least teach us something, so that this will never happen anytime or anywhere again." It was then asked of Chikatilo to stand, identify himself and provide his date and location of birth. Chikatilo complied, although this would prove to be one of the few civil exchanges between the judge and Chikatilo. Chikatilo was initially questioned in detail about each charge upon the indictment. Responding to specific questions regarding the murders, he often gave dismissive replies to questions, particularly when questioned as to the specific nature of the wounds he had inflicted upon his victims and the ruses he had used to entice his victims to the locations where he killed them. He would become indignant only when accused of stealing personal possessions from the victims, or to his retaining organs excised from the victims missing from the crime scene. On one occasion, when he was asked as to his seeing indifference as to the lifestyle and gender of those of whom he had killed, Chikatilo replied, "I did not need to look at them. Every step I took, they were there." In what became a regular, though not continuous, occurrence throughout the trial, the judge berated Chikatilo as he questioned him in detail to the charges, ordering him to shut his mouth before adding, "You're not crazy," as Chikatilo's responses to questions deviated into discussing issues such as the repression his family had endured throughout his childhood and his claiming that the charges filed against him were false. These verbal exchanges would occur whether Chikatilo was cooperative or uncooperative throughout proceedings, and the manner in which the judge questioned Chikatilo repeatedly led his defense lawyer to protest against the accusatory nature of the court proceedings. In the instance in which Chikatilo was uncooperative throughout questioning, he would simply shout over the judge, denounce the court as a farce, and launch into rambling, disjointed speeches. On occasion, Chikatilo would also expose himself in the court or sing socialist movement anthems throughout proceedings. These antics regularly resulted in him being returned to his cell as court proceedings continued in his absence. On the 21st of April, Chikatilo's defense lawyer requested that Bukhanovsky be allowed to testify as to the contents of the 1985 psychological profile he had written, and his subsequent consultations with Chikatilo following his arrest, adding that Bukhanovsky could exert influence over Chikatilo and, by extension, might influence the court proceedings. This request was denied. The same day, Chikatilo began to refuse to answer any questions from the judge, the prosecutor, or his own defense lawyer. He refused to answer any question for 3 consecutive days, before stating his presumption of innocence had been irredeemably violated by the judge and that he had intended to give no further testimony. The following day, proceedings were adjourned for 2 weeks. Chikatilo withdrew his confession to 6 of the killings for which he had been charged on the 13th of May, and also claimed he had killed 4 further victims who were not included upon the indictment. The same day, his defense again submitted a request that his client be subjected to a second psychiatric evaluation. This motion was dismissed by the judge as being groundless. In response, the defense rose from his seat, condemning the composition of the court and arguing that the judge was unfit to continue presiding over the case. Chikatilo himself repeated his earlier remarks as to the judge, making numerous rash remarks prejudging his guilt. The prosecutor vocally supported the defense's claim, stating that the judge had indeed made too many such comments and had committed numerous procedural violations in the lecturing and insulting of the defendant. The prosecutor further contended that in his conducting an open trial, Chikatilo had already been effectively prejudged as being guilty by the press, before also requesting that the judge be replaced. The judge would later rule that the prosecutor be replaced instead, briefly conducting the trial in the absence of a prosecutor until a replacement prosecutor could be found. On the 3rd of July, Bukhanovsky was permitted to testify as to his analysis of Chikatilo, although solely in the capacity as a witness. For 3 hours, Bukhanovsky testified as to his 1985 psychological profile of Chikatilo and of the conversations he had held with Chikatilo following his arrest, which had culminated in his confession. 4 psychiatric experts from the Serbsky Institute also testified as to the results of the behavioral analysis they had conducted on Chikatilo in May, following the initial adjournment of the trial. All testified as to his behavior in the courtroom being strikingly at contrast to his behavior in the cell, and that they considered his antics to be a calculated attempt to obtain acquittal on the grounds of insanity. On the 9th of August, the defense delivered their closing arguments before the judge. Upon beginning his 90-minute closing argument, the defense first stated he had no confidence his voice had been heard above the general outcry for retribution against Chikatilo, before questioning the reliability of the forensic evidence presented at the trial and describing areas of Chikatilo's confession as being baseless. He also questioned the judge's objectivity and harked back to the decision of the courts not to allow the defense to present testimony from independent psychiatrists, emphasizing that crimes of this nature could not have been committed by an individual of sane mind. They then formally requested the judge find his client not guilty. The following day, prosecutors delivered their closing argument to the judge. Harking towards the earlier testimony of psychiatrists at the trial, prosecutors argued that Chikatilo fully understood the criminality of his actions, was able to resist his homicidal impulses, and had made numerous conscious efforts to avoid detection. Moreover, they emphasized that in 19 of the charges, the material evidence of the crimes had been provided by Chikatilo himself. They then recited each of the charges before formally requesting the death penalty. Following the conclusion of the prosecutor's closing arguments, Chikatilo was invited back into the courtroom before formally asking whether he would like to make a final statement on his own behalf. In response, Chikatilo simply sat mute. The judge then announced an initial date of the 15th September for himself and 2 official jurors to review the evidence and pass a final sentence upon Chikatilo. This date was later postponed until the 14th of October. As court announced recess, the brother of Lyudmila Alexievna, a 17-year-old girl killed by Chikatilo in August 1984, threw a heavy chunk of metal at Chikatilo, hitting him in the chest. When security tried to arrest the young man, other victims' relatives shielded him. On the 14th of October, the court reconvened to hear formal sentencing. This sentencing would not finish until the following day. The judge began sentencing by announcing Chikatilo guilty of 52 of the 53 murders of which he had been tried. He was sentenced to death for each offence. Chikatilo was also found guilty of 5 counts of sexual assault committed during the years he worked as a teacher in the 1970s. In reciting his findings, the judge read the list of murders again, before criticising both the police and prosecuting departments for various mistakes in the investigation which allowed Chikatilo to remain free until 1990. Particular criticism was directed towards not local police but the prosecutor's department, primarily prosecutor Isaiah Kostoyev, whom the judge stated as negligent and whom had been dismissive of Chikatilo's inclusion upon the 1987 suspect list compiled by police. The judge also rejected the numerous claims Kostoyev had made to the media in the months prior to the trial that police had deliberately withheld documents pertaining to Chikatilo from the prosecutor's department as being provably baseless, adding that proof existed he had been in possession of all internal bulletins. On the 15th of October, the judge formally sentenced Chikatilo to death plus 86 years imprisonment for the 52 murders and 5 counts of sexual assault for which he had been found guilty. Chikatilo kicked his bench across his cage when he heard the verdict and began shouting abuse. However, when given an opportunity to make a speech in response to the verdict, he again remained silent. Upon passing final sentence, the judge made the following remark: Taking into consideration the horrible misdeeds of which he is guilty, this court has no alternative but to impose the only sentence that he deserves. I therefore sentence him to death. Chikatilo was taken from the courtroom to his cell where he awaited execution. He did lodge an appeal against the conviction with the Supreme Court of Russia, but this appeal was rejected in the summer of 1993. Following the rejection of his appeal to the Supreme Court, Chikatilo filed a final appeal for clemency with President Boris Yeltsin. This final appeal was rejected on the 4th of January 1994. On the 14th of February 1994, Chikatilo was taken from his death row cell to a soundproof room in the prison and executed with a single gunshot behind the right ear. He was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison cemetery. Told you it would be a long one. If you like that, then check out our Patreon, where for just $5 a month you get access to exclusive shows like Real Monsters and Playing with Bones with Amy Rose, along with early access to all our minisodes and ad-free access to the Weekend Update and It's Alive! Not convinced yet? Well, head on over now and have 7 days on us. That's a 7-day free trial for all new members. That's It's Alive Pod on Patreon. It's Alive! All the guts and go with none of the guilt. See you on Wednesdays, unless you're on Patreon when you get us all week long.